afternoon. This is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to another episode of Oilfield Strong. This one is very timely because we have Lee Fuller, who is officer with IPAA in charge of all their environmental and general strategy. More important than that, and he's been there since 1998, but more important than that is that he has an engineering background, has been on the regulatory side, the industry side, and so really brings a wealth of knowledge. And so the purpose of this is to bring up the federal final rule that was just issued and go into some specifics to try to help educate everyone as to what it's going to do to us and what we need to do about it. So with that, Lee, I really want to kind of dissect some of the key parts. It seems like LDAR is one of the initial one that everyone's talking about, and how you can use AVO, soap bubbles, who's going to now be required to do it, changes in the regulation associated with that. Let's start in that area. What do you have?
Okay. Thank you for having me on, Grant. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, this is great.
So let's kind of give some overarching dynamics with this package. First of all, this is final rule. We're not in proposal stage any longer. It's been released on EPA's website, but it hasn't been published in the Federal Register. One of the constraints that happens in that process is a lot of the supporting documents that EPA has for its regulations are not yet available to read until the Federal Register notice is actually published. Secondly, we're dealing with both a new source rule and emissions guidelines for existing sources. And those are very different in the way that they play out. The new source rule is going to be effective. EPA actually changed the effective date from November of 2021 into December of 2022. And then it has a number of items in the package that talks about how that transition takes place with things that were started after December of 2022 in terms of coming into compliance. The existing source package is one that goes to the next phase, being states developing plans to implement regulations at the state level for existing sources. And that process has a 2-year planning period and then a 3-year compliance period before all of the regulatory impact is felt on existing sources. All that being said, we're still dealing with some very prescriptive requirements on the part of EPA, and how that plays out in the states when they're looking at their programs, many of which have spent a decade or more putting together and do not track the kinds of approaches that EPA has. LDAR is a very good example of that.
Leak detection. Real quick on that before we dive there. When I hear 2 years plus 3 years, 5 years, if I'm an operator, I tend to say, why do I even need to worry about that? That's 5 years away, or at least 2 years, and then some more time. You know, would I be right if I'm an operator? Would I be right in thinking that just why worry about it right now, especially if I'm a small operator?
Well, I think the reason you need to worry about it right now is that if you look at the EPA framework requirements, they're basically model regulations, and they are ones that are very potentially risky for your small operation. I'll give you an example. The American Petroleum Institute did a study, and it looked at the impact on wells, existing wells, from 2 of the components of EPA's package as proposed, which have not changed dramatically, I would say, so far in my reading. One of them is LDAR, and one of them is the prohibition of natural gas-driven pneumatic controllers. When the API released a study that was done by Earth Science Systems, I think is their organization, and they concluded that if those 2 provisions were finalized like they'd been proposed, that 30% of existing sources would be uneconomic. That's 300,000 wells, and you can roughly assume that's about the number of 1 barrel a day and less combined oil and natural gas wells in the United States. So if you're a small operator, how the state now drafts its regulations will be critical to your future viability. And the reason you need to pay attention to it now is the states are going to start going through the process of crafting regulations and dealing with the Environmental Protection Agency in getting those regulatory structures approved so that they can regulate existing sources. That's what happens over the next 2 years. And the earlier you're engaged with it, the more possibility you have of impacting it in a positive way. After that 2-year period, you're going to have 3 years to comply, but it may also be on a schedule. You may not have the full 3 years, or you may have to have increments that you implement in stages over that 3-year period. So once the 2-year period is passed, you're basically on the hook at that point in time for whatever that final rule structure is developed.
So we don't necessarily have to, and when we talk about LDAR, for example, if you'd highlight things that we need to start doing now, you say pay attention to it. Well, that to me means I might have to start doing it in 2 years, but I don't have to do it right now. But if you could differentiate those, because it does sound like they need to be active, talking to their regulators, and congressmen, but maybe not change their operations.
Yes, that's what I'm really saying. So if you're sitting here today, the first thing you need to do is get a better understanding of what EPA has created as the model program for LDAR and how that affects your facilities. We'll talk about those details in a few minutes. But the second aspect of it then is you need to go to your state and start talking with them about the implications of the structure that EPA has, and trying to work with them to find ones that are more manageable for a small facility. Now, there is a provision in the generic program for existing sources, which is called Remaining Useful Life and Other Factors, or RULOF, which allows states to make alterations to their regulatory program depending on the impact it would have on the remaining useful life of an operation. But at least in the draft stages, and I haven't had a chance to really dig into not just the new rules that came out last week on the methane regulations, but a second rule that was also put out, which creates a generic structure for this rule-off process. If it is flexible enough to really respond to the needs of small operations. And that can be a critical factor. If it's unworkable, then it doesn't really help. It should be workable, but that doesn't mean EPA has crafted it as workable. So that's why I'm saying right away, you need to understand this is coming at you. The target's on your back. Environmental groups have been targeting not only existing wells, but small existing wells over the past decade. You can just watch it through the fact that we were dealing with regulations that were always related to new sources, but the focus was always what was going to be the impact on existing sources once the rules got there. So that's out there, unless there's opportunities to make changes and prove the limited amount of emissions from small wells in this planning process, then the 2-year period can be the time in which your future is sealed.
All right. No, that's a great intro. Appreciate that. So let's talk about LDAR, AVO, even down to soap bubbles. Kind of what are our options? What's about to happen to us from
so the historic LDAR program that EPA created back in 2016 for new sources is based on optical gas imaging, and that largely has been translated into a FLIR camera, forward-looking infrared, which is rather expensive, rather cumbersome, takes a lot of training. You have to have an expertise to be able to do it, and it costs money, a significant amount of money. Over the years, we have tried to work with EPA to encourage them to look at more cost-effective and much simpler methods to use for small facilities, while at the same time urging them to find more advanced and perhaps more cost-effective methods to use for larger facilities. The typical framework for the smaller operation is called AVO, or audio visual olfactory. Hear, look, smell, that you can do at sites and judge whether or not you may have some leaking operations. At the same time, ordinary maintenance is a significant part of that. If you look at the studies that have been done of emissions from smaller existing operations, the emissions tend to fall in about three significant categories. One is tanks, typically open thief hatches or bad seals. A second is faulty pneumatic controllers that are particularly intermittent controllers that are leaking when they're not operating. And the third tends to be just closing valves and things around the site when you're done with your your routine pumping or
just using a wrench to tighten things up.
Yeah, wrench. For all I know, maybe there's a valve you just have to turn.
Yep.
Those are the places where most of the emissions come from. And so a combination of having AVO and something like that would go a long way to deal with the 10% or so of existing wells that actually have leaks in any particular production category. So we've urged EPA to use this kind of approach, and they have finally embraced it. The question is, will they write it in such a way that it's actually usable? And that's one of the big issues that I'm looking at right now. EPA has created 4 categories of well types that apply for LDAR. Single well only sites, multiple well only sites, small wells, and then sort of everything else. In the single well site and the small well sites, EPA has provided for an AVO program quarterly. It would seem like a manageable set of operations to deal with LDAR. But then when you look at the definitions of what falls in those categories, the definition for the other category, which is the large well category, in which the requirements are primarily the optical gas imaging on a fairly aggressive basis, as well as some AVO in between the OGI testing. The definition includes things like a controller at the site, or more than one tank, storage vessel at the site. And it seems to me that that is going to describe a lot of small well sites. And as a result, the benefit of having AVO is lost because of the way the definition is written. Now, let's put that in some context. Why does EPA have this rationale for this large facilities characterization? It says it's because its studies have shown that these are sites where you typically see super emitter problems, and EPA has a program in this package of regulations for super emitters. Well, what's a super emitter? Super emitter is 100 kilograms an hour. If you translate that into MCF a day, it's around 130, I think. If you look at that bottom tier, again, the most vulnerable tier of those wells that are in jeopardy, the 1 barrel a day is about 6 MCF a day. So how does a 6 MCF a day produce 130 MCF a day super emitter? It can't.
Yeah.
And that's where the pragmatic structure of this LDAR program is missing. And it's one of the areas that we're wanting to continue to press. We have some options going forward at this point, and we'll keep all of those open. One of them is a motion for reconsideration. The other is to litigate the rule in a much broader sense. And there are limits on what EPA can do to reconsider, but we hope that we can come back with some pragmatic discussions on this and try to convince EPA that it needs to change that. The second, maybe the second pathway, though, is what happens at the state level when they get to trying to turn these emissions guidelines, which is where that regulatory structure is also embedded into day-to-day regulations in the state, and whether their programs are going to be able to be shown to EPA to be equivalent. Here's one of the realities. EPA has this component-based LDAR program that it's created. How many pieces of equipment do you have in defining these areas? I'm unaware of any state that uses that approach for an LDAR program. And that's just a conflict waiting to happen between the federal government and the states that makes no sense to have to occur, but it could well.
If I read back on kind of the whole LDAR AVO, it seems like for several of those categories that they're wanting AVO quarterly, but you would still have to do LDAR, a formal LDAR type program every 6 months.
That's particularly true of the multi-well only site, that you do AVO, but you also have to do semi-annual OGI. I believe that's the one you're probably thinking about.
Right.
But in the small sites, it's essentially just an AVO program. Maybe there may be an annual requirement or one annual requirement. I'd have to frankly look at that, to be candid.
And then okay, so no other real changes for the folks that are doing LDAR now are going to continue to do it. They might, I did understand that you might want to start doing it quarterly so that if you do have a leak, you can go back to a closer time to say that leak wasn't
yeah, that would be true. If you're doing something quarterly, you're able to, basically say, okay, we found it, we fixed it. So you can't assume it's there for 6 months or a year. That actually has,
because it assumes that it goes all the way back to the last time you did.
It assumes it goes, it could be a quarter. Yeah. And another place that actually has a bearing is in the methane tax world, where you're doing emissions estimates of your operations. And to the degree that you have information showing that you've been maintaining this facility and not had leaks, that part of your fugitive emissions calculation in that program as well.
Okay. You brought up super emitter. The fun thing about that fun being in quotes, is that it appears that they're kind of enabling various people to go and identify wells that they believe are super emitter. And so I guess people are going to take their own OGI camera out and identify, or they just identify it and then they go report it. That seems like that could just be a license to just be crazy.
It has the potential to be a very invasive and inappropriate program for people being at risk going to sites, but EPA,
but they're not allowed on the site, are they?
No,
they just have to.
No, you're not. You're not supposed to be allowed on the site.
Right, but so, from the lease line or from the road, you can still see a lot.
Now, so EPA has constrained some of these options in this program as to how it can be done to avoid just the random person driving by with a FLIR camera that doesn't know how to use and shooting it, saying, "Oh, that's a super emitter." You're going to have to be. There's going to be only certain technologies which EPA will approve, and some of those are actually more like planes and satellites than it is driving by in your truck.
Okay.
And then you're going to have to be certified that you're competent at utilizing that equipment to do the kind of testing associated with these super emitters. And if you turn out not to be competent and you start sending in bad information on a regular basis, after 3 of those, you can be decertified, and then you can't take the data anymore, as I read it.
Well, that's assuming someone's going to go to that. I could think of a state near Texas that probably won't worry about that, but that's another.
Well, so this is it's interesting you raise that point, because here's one of the issues that's very unclear in this package on the super emitter is who is going to be the primary player in it. The way it's described
from a regulatory standpoint.
A regulatory standpoint. Okay. The way it's described in the rules, if you go out and take data and you find a super emitter, what you think is a super emitter, you submit that data to EPA, and then it analyzes whether in fact the data is accurate. If it finds it's accurate, then it goes to the operator to alert them that they've found this information. Now, this could be 15 days or a month later, at which point in time, whether there was a super emitter event or not, it'd be very hard to find. And some of the super emitter events may well be maintenance that's going on at a facility when somebody drives by or when they get the sample from the air. But here's where it becomes confusing with respect to EPA and the states. The NSPS program is a program that can be delegated to states, and most states in the oil and gas arena for production have been delegated the authority. So when EPA comes up with these new source performance standards for facilities, even though those are regulations, it's actually the state who is doing the permitting analysis and doing the permitting if it's been delegated that authority. They're using EPA's rules, but they're actually doing the programs themselves. So if they've been delegated the authority in general over NSPS, New Source Performance Standards, where does super emitter fit in that? Do they get the data instead of EPA? Are they responsible for responding instead of EPA? Or as EPA basically preempted the state, in which case the state may have its own program. And now you've got two regulatory pathways you have to worry about if they start getting into it as well. And that's I'm confused, frankly, on exactly how this is supposed to fit together. And I haven't, in reading through the packages of information so far, I have not been convinced that I understand it more than what I've explained there.
In a talk I did with the Director of Enforcement for New Mexico, it sure sounds like EPA has the money, so they're doing the scans, they identify it, and then they've handed it over to New Mexico for them to document and litigate. And so it's, but that could just be New Mexico.
But that's also not this program, because this program doesn't exist. I think what you're talking about, the EPA is out collecting data on emissions, or somebody else is giving them data.
Yeah, that's before this. This isn't super emitter at all.
So this is a different, and it's got very explicit actions that are laid out in the proposal or in the final rule. The other reality about this, I think, is that realistically what's going to happen is you're going to find a group of people like some of the environmental advocates who have been doing sampling all over the country, and Permian Basin in particular, for the past several years, will essentially hire out that capacity to local activists who want to pursue a particular source or set of sources in their community. And that's going to be an interesting dynamic, I think, that the industry is going to have to deal with in terms of how they handle their local interactions.
So it's not clear as to, okay, you have someone come, say that you're a super emitter, turn you into somebody, and then what happens thereafter isn't quite figured out. So it's, all of this is to be determined.
It does not create an instant enforcement action. It creates material going to EPA saying we think this is a super emitter, which then trigger, if EPA agrees that the quality of the work demonstrates that, then EPA goes to the operator and says, we've had this report, you need to come back to us within a time window responding to this. Now your response could be, not me, I don't know, maybe the guy down the road, but not I don't have anything here that says that. It may be, oh yeah, we had an emission because we were doing a particular maintenance operation at the site, and there was some gas that got out for 3 hours while we were doing the maintenance work. Or yeah, we did have a super emitter and we've now fixed it. We had a bad problem, piece of equipment failed. It took us several hours to shut it down, and it's done, it's over. And then at that point in time, it becomes unclear exactly what that means in terms of using any of this information for enforcement purposes.
another area that's kind of related to all this LDAR and monitoring is continuous monitoring, remote sensing. There seems to be a big push to add technology, whether that's flyovers, satellite, continuous monitoring. Again, a little vague on what they mean by improved technology, but where do you think that goes, or where do you think this final rule is trying to push us?
I think the final rule is trying to open up the door on that as in many generally positive ways. This is also another issue that we've had over the past decade. EPA started regulating in a serious way oil and gas production operations in 2012. In 2016, it came out with a rule that really got into the leak detection and repair issue. It was a new source performance standard. So it was really affecting new facilities. And it was this FLIR camera OGI program that they created there. As soon as that came out, people said, look, you're kind of signed on to the steam engine and the diesel's coming in. And we want to use the diesel. We don't want to use the steam engine anymore. And so what compounded the process was that EPA's assessment of the Clean Air Act, the process that was in there, was very rigorous in terms of creating alternative methods of emission testing. Built around, for like most things in the Clean Air Act, a fixed facility, a refinery or a steel plant or a chemical plant is going to be there for 150 years. And what you're doing is coming up with an alternative way of controlling something in there than EPA's. And so now they were trying to apply that into this new technology in a testing mechanism, not in an actual control mechanism. And it really wasn't working very well. And the industry, and frankly, a lot of environmental groups have been pushing the agency to try to get a better system in place. And they've tried to do that in this final rule. They've tried to create some opportunities for facilities to use continuous monitoring, use better, simpler mechanisms, whether it's aerial or site mechanisms, and use that instead of the current OGI practice. I think these are probably considered, to some degree, OGI, although the optical part there may be a little confusing to me. Yeah. But they're trying to use these doors for advanced methodologies to come in, get certified in some way, be melded into a system that different companies could use, and then displace the systems that they're currently using with better ones. And in some cases, that could be a type of technology. In some cases, it would be a mix of technologies. Perhaps some fixed facilities or on-site facilities, perhaps some drone or aircraft sampling that's added to it. But I have not had a chance to speak with a lot of the operators who've been engaged with this. I think they could view it as a positive indication from EPA that it's trying to hear them and trying to come up with better systems. But in the past, when they've tried to do that, one of the challenges has been that when EPA wants to let you shift technologies, they want to change the frequency of testing. And by the time you change the frequency of testing, you've lost all the advantage of the new technology. And so this has to do with, sensitivities of the technology and how often it's used and whether it's continuous or not. But those are things that I think they are trying to do in this package. I don't know if they've succeeded, but that's one of the areas of a positive response from EPA.
From what I've seen, though, it's still in a very general term. It doesn't speak to exact technologies and exact applications.
No, that's great. And I don't think you want it to, because you don't want to, in effect, pick today's technologies just like they effectively did with the original tech requirements, and then 6 months from now there's a new, much better technology that's much cheaper, and it's now got to start from scratch somehow. It does require certification processes, so it's not just a carte blanche to say, oh, I've got a new technology and I can use it, you've got to go through a process and demonstrate to EPA that it's one that can fit into the structure that they're creating.
So for the next year or two, as they all kind of figure that out, if I'm an operator, I'll throw this out, you can correct me. If I'm an operator, I'm not required to go put continuous monitoring in to do flyovers. I could if I wanted to, but that's not a requirement for the next year or two till they get that figured out.
Yeah. The requirements are going to be essentially based on what they have been based on, which is the FLIR camera approach as a minimum. And then your option is to come in as an operator and show that you've got a better system or an equivalent system using a different mix of technologies than that one, and then EPA or the state. Again, this is a delegation question here too. We'll make a judgment about whether that's correct, and how quickly that'll take off. I think is an open question at this point.
And that sounds painful to have to take my procedure up to EPA to get certified. That's
and again, this is more explicitly available for new and existing technologies. New and modified facilities under the NSPS. That's really where it's being structured in there, and the existing source piece of it is going to be wrapped up in this implementation plan process for 2 years. So it won't necessarily be structured in a complete way until that rulemaking process is done. It also raises questions about a facility that's partly new and partly existing. What are they going to do? How do
then
they
it's modified and
Yeah,
how that's done. That's
So
always been tricky.
There's nothing really simple about this in terms of the practical application of it.
So, there's also a lot of talk about data and filing data, and obviously for the methane tax, it's all data driven on how many components and all. So it all seems to be collecting this. How do you see the reporting and the data requirements being affected either by this final rule, or you can expand it beyond to include methane tax and some other things?
I haven't really dug into the explicit reporting requirements in this rule. Many of them have to do with demonstrating that you've done what you're required to do in terms of maintaining the equipment, doing the test when you're supposed to do it, as opposed to the calculation of emissions. You're well aware there's a lot of technology that can find emissions. There's not a lot of technology that can turn that into a mass per hour type result. Most
volumetrics, yep.
Most of that is done through emissions factors based on the on studies that are done by experts, or hopefully experts. And that process is really much more visible in the methane tax world, because there the basis for the taxes are reports under subpart W of the greenhouse gas reporting program. EPA has proposed revisions to subpart W. Those will become final sometime in 2024. They're probably not going to be available for the methane tax until 2025. I think you've done some work yourself in looking at the quality of what was done in that proposal, and it wasn't all that impressive.
No.
The numbers went up because EPA was going to different studies for its emissions factors, but not validating either that study or their current work. And that's going to be, I think, a continuing debatable problem for quite some time. It's not as much of an issue in complying with the EPA regulations as it is when you start getting into the methane tax, because most of the regulations are not written as emissions limits. They may be written based on estimate of the emissions and then what technology you apply. So for example, if your tank is less than 6 tons a year of VOC or 20 tons a year of methane, you're not required to do a vapor capture, recovery, disposal technology on that tank. But once you reach that threshold, then you're required to do certain physical things at the tank. You have to capture the vapor. Vapor has to either be destroyed or recovered in some way. And most of the regulations tend to be written that way. Even the LDAR regulations are not telling you that you need to know the mass of what's coming out. It's telling you that you need to know whether there's an emission. If there's an emission, then you have to fix it. Now they have sensitivity levels, obviously, in all these samplers, which have to some degree create a volume of emissions below which you're not taking action.
What you mentioned also kind of changed subject slightly, the various controllers, actuators, how that's really and that's been an issue for a while because of greenhouse gas, subpart W.
Yeah.
But that they're continuing to really push hard on those to change out the actuators and controllers.
Yes, with the exception of Alaska, basically what EPA wants to eliminate the use of natural gas driven pneumatic controllers. And it's concluded that that's cost effective. So it wants to see a shift to either alternatively powered controllers like solar or some other electrical power base, or instrument air or nitrogen based air, obviously not air, but nitrogen based pneumatic controller systems. And it has been essentially relentless in this assessment. Many people have tried to suggest that there are states already, and many people already have been capturing the gas off the controller and transferring it to some other control device like a combustor or re-injecting it into their system somehow. And that would effectively limit the concerns that EPA has on pneumatic controllers. One of the great frustrations in this debate is because the subpart W calculation for particularly intermittent pneumatic controllers produces a very high component percentage of many sites, up to 50% of the methane emissions at sites reporting under greenhouse gas inventory will be based on intermittent pneumatic control or natural gas or methane release. Problem with that is when you go in and look at the background data on where that number comes from, it came from a study that involved 19 controllers in 1990s and produced a result from that. Lots of other studies have taken place, and most of them have showed that one is too high. When EPA looked at revising it, they did reduce it from 13 roughly to 8. But if you looked at the basis for that reduction, they really didn't do what I would consider to be a very good set of engineering calculations. They essentially had six studies. I think they threw out 2 of them because they'd calculated emissions based on the actual calculations based on the operation of the controller, and the others they averaged together. But the original study had 19 controllers. Some of these others had 150. Did they weight them? No, they just averaged them.
Yeah.
If you threw all of the stuff in together, including these studies that they threw out, the number came up to be around 4 scuffs an hour instead of 13. And so when you're looking at the justification in this regulation, what are they basing it on? They're basing it on that 13 for intermittent pneumatic controllers, and so they're getting benefits calculations or the magnitude of the risk that they're trying to reduce is in my view, at least from looking at all this data, out of proportion to reality. They're going to claim a lot of benefits that they're never going to get because it was never that high. And yet they've been unwilling to consider arguments not only on that calculation, but there's a second calculation where you're allowed to parse your data between faulty controllers and effectively operating controllers, which knocks that 13 number down to by 80 to 90%. So now you're down into the 0.13 or something like that number, or 1 point. So 1.3 number. So if you look at the justification that EPA has used for its technology requirements to exclude capture of vapor and incineration of it or reinjection of it, I don't think they've made a valid calculation, but they've been unyielding in pressing for the removal. Now there were a lot of companies who spent a good deal of money replacing all their high bleed controllers at their existing facilities with low bleed controllers or updated intermittent controllers.
Huge.
Throw them all out, got to rip them all out and get rid of them. Go with solar controllers or something like that, or build an instrument air system. Well, an instrument air system may work fine on a 20 well, big, hydraulically fractured modern site, but you can't use it on a 3 barrel a day single well site over here that has one controller on. It just doesn't work. It's cost effective. It's
a lot of those don't even have electricity, and that's a starting point. Now you could do solar, but if it turns on and off quite a bit, uses a lot of volume of air, you never can catch up because of the limitations of solar. So again, that's all more for methane tax, greenhouse gas. There is some weaving of that into this final rule.
Well, the final rule is basically saying zero emission controllers. They're now calling them process. If it's a zero emission process controller, it's no longer an affected facility because it has no emissions. So they're not, they're out of the regulatory pool if you go that direction.
Okay. No, thanks for the clarification of that. So it's, well, what have I missed that we need to share, and then we'll shut this down?
I wish I knew what I've missed so far, as probably my first answer. I'm still digging through it. There's a lot of material that's not out there yet to look at. Our options are obviously limited because this is a final rule, which means we've now got to
deal with what we got.
We've got to find steps that either get EPA to look at it again, or people have to decide whether they want to contest it. And then we have the state programs, and I think the state programs is a place where particularly smaller producers really need to early on to go get in and start talking to their regulators about what the consequences of some of these things may be. And I think some regulators are sympathetic to that. They don't see the benefits in all of this, or they've already invested a huge amount of effort crafting a regulatory program that they think is probably better than what EPA is putting out there, and they don't want to walk away from it.
I can see that with several states through the Rockies and all, definitely. Yeah. So, well, this is definitely going to be a journey where we figure out more information and see how it's applied at the state and federal and the industry response. So look forward to having you come back as some layers of the onion are peeled away and we see a little bit more. But Lee, thank you very much for your time. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, everyone.